we're good. Greetings, thanks for tuning in if you're on the YouTube channel. Also, thank you for those of you who are gracing us with your presence this morning, both patients, families, guests. We have a nice full room, and we were just privileged to have a powerful sung testimony of the pain that ties right in with the subject matter for the day. So, shout out to Sophie for that incredible. People on YouTube are going to be, what? But it was powerful. I came to work at Caron in 2008 with a lot of preparation before that. So trying to do the math on how old I was, but I was almost 50, and I had significant time in my addiction recovery, and I had gone from early identification as an atheist to becoming a seminarian and then a pastor, and I had a lot of church experience, but I was new to clinical chaplaincy, and there was this person who helped me be recruited, who was the principal founder of the Caron Chapel Service. His name was Father Billy, passed away 5+ years ago, and the degree to which his presence is still on this campus is a remarkable testimony to who he was and what an impact he made on this place. And I will never be able to sort of really fully capture that for those of you who don't know him, but I try to remember him to some degree every Sunday, because this was the place where his impact reached the largest number of people, I think. And I'm bringing him up partly because he taught me so many things. And one of the things early on, might have been February of 2008, I was still new here, and I was kind of trying to take this thing in that was the chapel service at that time. And there was a particular chapel service where there had been news of a recent patient's departure and overdose, suicide, death. It was awful. And I was curious how this would impact the chapel service, because, without getting too long into the details, there were patients here who still were aware of it. We had longer lengths of stay, so that made that possible. People were here longer, so there were still people in these long trajectories, and the person had been here, maybe 6 weeks prior, but the news of his death was still really hard. And Father Bill, in his wisdom, told me in the closet before we came in here that he was going to orient the chapel towards loss. Most of our chapels in that time were not thematically arranged other than around the subject of addiction. I didn't know what that was going to look like. And there were various things that he did that day, one of which was this corporate lament. He had a way at a song that we would play. It was a tearjerker song. And while he was playing it, people would shout out the names of their beloved dead. And there's actually a religious tradition in Korean worship, I forget the name of it, but that is very much like that, sort of people shouting out popcorn style, talking over one another. It's a beautiful form of prayer. But if you were sitting in this room and you had a lost loved one, it was a very deliberate manipulation of your emotions. And I think in a very well-meant way, it also ripped most of us, it was painful. And I'm taught as a clinician to be cautious about how we approach helping people explore the emotional realities of their journey, because there's a lot of wisdom today that just the bleeding out of the pain is not necessarily always therapeutic. At the same time, here's the thing. Addiction is an avoidance for a lot of us. And that I want to talk about loss, and I want to talk about kind of two different directions that people can take in the face of suffering in a general sense. And I have way too much to say today for the amount of time it's okay for me to take. So I'm going to snip and cut here, and then we'll end up, I'll be like, oh, I need to shut up. So let me keep going. The most common way in which people conceive of the word loss and the word grief is in relation to death. But that's not the only place it applies. If you experience a marriage is ending, that is hard. One of my dear friends said to me after my first marriage ended. She said, Jack, you know what's the worst thing about divorce? And I said, what? He said, they don't die. And it was terrible. Now my first wife has now passed away, so I guess I hope that she'll cut me a break for that one. But there was a point there. Anyway, different losses hurt in different ways. And job changes, and there's a ton of loss that comes in association with just by having to come into this room. One of the insights that finally hit me was that change always involves loss. Even if you're coming out of like a hostage situation, the Stockholm syndrome or whatever, like even if you're leaving a terrible thing and going to a better thing, there's some weird way in which the unfamiliarity can cause you to go, oh, at least it was misery I was familiar with. So people are weird. And that we could experience bereavement. I can't tell you how many times I've had people come to me and they're referred to me for a brief consultation, and it's the death of a parent who was awful. I mean, they were terrible and abusive or whatever, but still the patient is having to negotiate how to now figure out how to move forward, because now this person who was a very difficult influence in their life is no longer living. And it doesn't, most of you who've never had that experience might think, well, I bet you're just glad the jerk is finished the course of life. But if they were your biological parent, it's way more complicated than that. So, or can be. One of the important things I wanted to make sure I talked about was the avoidance of the sufferings of grief. And there were two stories I thought about. I'll tell you about the stories, I'll tell you the stories entirely. One was about my mom after my dad died. And one was about a friend who I went to visit his family's home to attend like a wedding, and they said, oh, you can stay with us. So the first story, very brief, was my friend Tommy. His twin had died of a suicide. And I had never been to the family residence, whatever, but I knew of the death of the brother. And when I walked into this home, it had the feeling of like a museum. There was a peculiar thing. I remember the piano, because I'm a piano player, and I remember the piano had tons of photographs on it. And I remember also, they actually invited me to stay in the bedroom of the deceased brother. Now, this was a long, long time ago, and I never really reconnected with the family, but I will tell you, going to sleep in that bedroom, not only was I'm like, gosh, this is weird, but then when I opened the door, the brother had died probably like 8 years prior, and the bedroom was still intact. There were still pennants from the sports engagement. They had been unable to turn the bedroom into other purpose. So what had happened was this particular family, God bless them, time had stopped for them on this particular day when their boy died. Time stopped for my mom when my dad died. And I put these two things together because to me they indicate something. There are all these theories about grief, including the very most famous, which is the one most of you have probably heard of, 5 stages of grief. I'm not a fan of the theory. And it's a misapplied theory, by the way. She studied terminal illness. People adapted it to say it applies to people getting their long hair cut short. Like it's just way too broadly generalized. I'm not saying there isn't wisdom and insight, and she was a brilliant and wonderful person, but it's been applied as a one-size-fits-all notion. And I've been blessed in my training as a chaplain to not only sit with tons of people around varieties of experiences of grief, but also to do some homework around it and study various theoreticians who have approached the subject of grief. I'll get back to where I was in a minute. But here's the thing that happens with grief theories, is it's almost like a mathematical thing, and mathematics does this all the time. I was a big fan of math. But in order to study something complex, you study the simple incident of it, right? And so the grief theoretician who comes out with a grief theory usually comes out with a grief theory when a loss occurs, X, Y, Z. But the problem with that is it's oversimplifying the reality. When you and I experience the next loss you experience, it layers on top of and modifies your grief narrative over the course of your life. And none of us is spared loss. Like, it's just a part of the deal. It's almost as if, I had this line earlier in the week, and it's already gone from me, but let me see if it comes back. That loss is the rear view mirror of attachment. It's the thing that shows us that we cared about something. So if loss happens and you don't give a darn at all, then you didn't care about it to begin with. And a lot of losses do happen like that. They matter to somebody else, but they don't matter to you. That means that you didn't. Then there's no work to be done. But when losses are studied in the singular and they're like, this is how it goes, or this is what you do. What if it's the 15th? Or what if there are 6 that are happening? What if one happened last week and there's one that happened 2 weeks later? Which is how it sort of goes. Losses come in these weird seasons. I've known people with morticians who have told me, like, you want to know when people are going to die in this town? It's when I'm about to go on vacation. I really had a dear friend of mine who was in that line of work who said that that's like his best predictor of how the cycles of his job would go. Is he would arrange a vacation, and then on the night before the flight out, he'd get a phone call, and be the mayor's wife or whatever. He'd be like, well, I obviously can't go. So anyway, stand right. The phenomenon I talked about with my mom and with my friend is indicative of what I think of as the closest thing that we can say to where to be concerned. Because I think it's like I'm not really a fisherman, but I think you have to let the fish run on the line with grief. I think you have to let people grieve, and there's not a right way. That to me is really important as a grief clinician, is to realize that even siblings and members of the same family will each manifest, and we know that even more, like siblings are so different from each other, but that grief will unfold in a way that is organic to one person and organic to the next, and neither one is doing it right. They're just doing what their survival strategy manifests as. And yet, the thing that is indicative of the most clinical concern to me is when the time stop thing happens. When the ability to stay at pace with the course of life events around you is no longer, you're no longer connected. So because those photos on the piano should have changed. Over 11 years, the photos on the piano should have changed. I should, that's really, it would make sense in any other family for the photos on the piano to change. You'd add new photos because the kid's graduation or whatever, and eventually, somebody would break up and you'd erase the person, we don't really, and those are hard things, but it's the thing. And the bedroom would eventually, if the child had been able to grow and go off to college, you would, eventually say, well, get your crap out of here, and we're going to use the room as, dad's gym or whatever. But that couldn't happen. These people are frozen in time with this bereavement that is indicative of a stuckness that makes me grieve when I feel in relation to it. So, take that day in 2008. What I've learned from 16 years of being here is that anyone with the wristband in this room, if there was an actuary, those are the people who set life insurance rates, mathematicians. If there was an actuary studying you and your mortality probabilities, sadly, suicide and overdose are now way up on the list compared to any other person. It's like the killer of people who have addiction. I make calls when we learn that patients have passed away, and so I have years of evidence about this, because when I make those phone calls, I don't probe, but almost invariably the family provides me information about what happened. And it's like every once in a while I make the phone call and it's there was this person, even if they were hit by, but then it's hit by a drunk driver. So it's like an addiction. It's just and it's all over the place here. And so bereavement, and the biggest change that's happened in my 16 years of working on this mountain is Narcan. Because now what's happened is not that less people die, but it's that there are a whole crop of people. If we ask for hands, I bet there are people in here who have had 2, 3, 4 overdoses and are still here because of this miracle medicine that takes the dead and brings them weirdly back to life. It's just, so I'm not trying to be or whatever, but I'm trying to say that we are a community that must abide grieving as an integral part of what it means to become connected to Caron. You're like an unlucky member of a club, and this is going to be part of, and maybe gosh, the song that we just heard was sung by somebody who felt the wound, right? And so I did want to talk also about what my profession has helped me see, and I had this thing, I'm not gonna veer away from it. I've been trained to pay attention to wisdom traditions rather than just clinical models and theories. So I like things that are old, ancient documents, ancient things, and I think there's stuff to teach us, which when I was like 20, I thought, why do people read something that's 2,000 years old? Like, what? Now I'm like, why wouldn't you want to read something that's 2,000 years old? So I want to touch base quickly. I've learned things about this grief stuff, this grief landscape from Judaism, from Buddhism, and from Christianity. And I think all of them are like beautiful things that I've seen, and I'm like, so this is my overloading all of us with too many thoughts and ideas, and I can hear my preaching professor say, Jack, this is too much. Okay, so first of all, Judaism. The thing that I have from takeaways from my experience around Judaism is that two things that the Jewish community does really well around bereavement is to gather and remember. So the sitting Shiva thing, I don't know if you know what that is, but that's like this gathering thing, and it's like it's the first order of business. Let's go visit the family. It's not like you know what you're going to say. It's not like there's a right thing to say. It's just like show up. So that's an important thing. If you're wondering what to do when you have a loved one or a loss, show up. And then remember, Judaism is incredible in its like unbelievable insistence on we will never forget. We will never forget. God stretched out a mighty arm and brought us out of Israel. Or Abraham answered the call. Or this idea that memory is a way of honoring the dead and of honoring loss is a beautiful thing. And one would argue at some level, this family that I was talking about was honoring their dead by remembering their son. And all of these things have their place. And God forbid we should forget. Like it would be a terrible thing for us to just want to erase people. If we decide we want to erase those who have left us from our mind, we are doing ourselves and them a terrible disservice. What is the old line? If you forget history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? Buddhism. Buddhism is like a really interesting thing because it's always held an appeal to me at like some degree of distance. I didn't grow up in a Buddhist family or tradition or culture, but it's almost like it was the dangly, shining thing on the other side of the planet. And a lot of Americans are guilty of that. And there are a lot of Buddhist teachers who sort of laugh at our sort of grass is greener on the other side, sort of intrigue in the Buddhist and Hindu worlds. That doesn't mean that there's not more to say about it and more to take. So when I was 16, I did a little mini dive in Buddhism. When I was in my interfaith training as a chaplain, I did a deeper dive. And then recently, in the last year or two, I've returned to Buddhist practice and teaching as a thing that's influencing me deeply. And my big surprise about it is how wrong I was at 16 and even like a decade ago in what I thought Buddhism was really about. Because here's the big thing. Buddhism's voice in response to the reality of suffering, my two high notes from it are compassion and forgiveness. Did you know that compassion and forgiveness are like major points of emphasis in Buddhism? I don't know that people really get that. I think people are like, oh, it's about, overcoming suffering and people make of Buddhism as if it's somehow not grounded in the reality of our experience, but it couldn't be more grounded in the reality of our experience. And the two most cherished of the meditative practices, I think, among the most meditative practices cherished in Buddhism are a compassion and a forgiveness practice. So not only should we show up and remember, but we could love and try to forgive. And then the Buddhists tell us also, you probably won't be able to. So you have to love yourself and forgive yourself for not being able to love and forgive. They're really good at paradox and recursion. But they're right. Like it's true. There's some people in the room who are like, I'll never forgive that. I might have been in that place a couple times in my life. And even people I've sought to really forgive some wounds, I realize they can still resurface, right? But so I'm an imperfect being. But I do know it will heal me if I can bring love and forgiveness instead of because that's like not healthy. So wisdom, this is thousands of years of wisdom calling to us in the face of our suffering. Instead of avoiding suffering and getting drunk and stopping time and running from it, there are things that we can do to tolerate the discomfort, to stay in the pain. And the shortest way out is through, not around. And then Christianity, which was my home tradition as a child, and I would say still is my home tradition, and to call any of these singular is wrong. So there are Buddhisms, and there are Judaisms, and there are Christianities. And I think those of us who know Christianity, maybe we know more because you have like the Episcopal, the Lutheran, the Methodist, the Orthodox, the Catholic, the Franciscan. Even within one tradition, you have all these different sort of expressions. To call them singular is, to some degree, to either reflect a lack of like a certain naivety about it, or to perhaps try to oversimplify. But that's, I got only so many minutes. So, and we're gatherers in our silence as human beings. But Christianity, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, is a central thing. And his teachings on solidarity with people in suffering are central. But a top note of the Christian message, as I understand it, is service. To be of help to your neighbor. Love God, love your neighbor. Like that's actually comes out of Judaism. But then Jesus says, no, that's the single most essential thing we're going to take out of Judaism and bring forward. And so this is a very powerful medicine that we can bring to our pain, is to use our pain to help another person. And then one of the things I think is so beautiful, and then I will finish up, is commemoration. And I think that sounds like Jewish memory, but I don't mean it that way. I was taught by my uncle, who was a Roman Catholic religious brother all of his life. He gave vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Didn't ever choose the path of priesthood, but lived as a monk his whole life. Beautiful man. And he taught me to honor those who have died by remembering them and learning from them. So you have like St. Francis or St. Christopher or whatever, like these sanctual observances in the Christian traditions that have saints. But also like my dead mother or dead dad or my deceased brother or whatever. And this comes right down to when Father Bill was here in 2008. He used to say this thing when we would have these loss-oriented Sundays. And it used to not sit easily with me, but here I am saying it. Some of us die that others might live. I wish I could take away all the roll call of the dead. I can't. And we're not going to actually enact that ritual today, but I know it's there. I know if we were to shout out our names, we each have those who would be on our bereavement cards. But the best way we can honor them is to stay in this lane, not to go off the rails and become one of the frozen on the way to death people who cannot stay in the reality of our experience. So we honor your brother. You honor your brother by being here. We honor all those whose ashes and memorials are the tree across the side of the way by persevering in the project of recovery. And that means gathering, remembering, being compassionate, forgiving, serving, and in that way we honor our beloved dead. I hope you'll join me in this work. Thank you.